Is the Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory coming to an end? The United States and the Ukrainian government have taken action to end Russia's occupation of Ukrainian territory. The United States and Western leaders do not allow the weapons and military equipment they have sent to Ukraine to be used on Russian territory. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is appealing to his allies and asking for permission to use these weapons within the borders of Russia as well. However, when the Ukrainian army achieved a great success on the territory of Kursk without using the weapons and military equipment they had obtained from their allies, Russian leader Vladimir Putin realized the seriousness of the situation. Ukrainian President Zelensky has given the impression that this war could end if sufficient support is given to Ukraine. International news agencies are reporting that promises have been made to end this war in Ukraine during the elections to be held in the United States. It has been confirmed that U.S. President Joe Biden will leave office. It is even believed that Ukrainian President Zelensky has switched his army from a defensive position to an offensive position for these reasons. So how does the U.S. administration plan to end this war on Ukrainian soil? We are witnessing one of the most decadent periods of the war between Russia and Ukraine. The fact that the Russian army's advance on Ukrainian territory stopped and the Ukrainian army was no longer defending but attacking caused the whole world to turn its eyes to this war again. The main question is, how did the Ukrainian army manage to enter the territory of Kursk so easily? As it is known, Russian General Valery Gerasimov has launched an attack on the Ukrainian city of Kharkov. And what was the purpose of this attack? Russian leader Vladimir Putin was forced to create a new front in Ukraine because he failed to invade the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Under normal circumstances, the Kremlin administration thought that the Russian army would advance through the territory of Kherson and occupy the capital, Kiev, within about 6 months. Only the complete destruction of the Ukrainian army's shipping routes and bridges in the Kherson region prevented the Russian army from advancing in Kherson and approaching Kiev. For this very reason, months later, the Russian army launched an attack on the city of Kharkov, creating a new front through the territory of Belgorod. The main purpose of this attack was to invade Kiev by advancing through the territory of Kharkov and conclude this war with a great Russian victory. However, the sudden entry of the Ukrainian army into the borders of Kursk on August 6th and its rapid advance here have disrupted the plans of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now there are claims that this war will end completely. Will the seizure of the territory of Kursk by the Ukrainian army allow Russia to completely withdraw from Ukraine? Recently, international news agencies have managed to attract attention all over the world by sharing headlines under the heading Zelensky's Secret Victory Plan. So what is this secret plan of Ukrainian President Zelensky? What does this list of proposals that are planned to be presented to Joe Biden in the coming months say? These developments, which have excited the whole world, have managed to become the subject of the agenda all over the world. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced to the whole world that he was ready to present the victory plan for ending the war with Russia to the United States in his statement. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky does not want to give any details about his mysterious plan. However, the Ukrainian leader stated that these operations organized on the territory of Kursk are just the beginning. At the same time, Ukraine stated that this secret victory plan would be shared not only with Joe Biden, but also with U.S. presidential candidates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. The Ukrainian army is moving quite quickly in the Kursk operation, which it launched at the beginning of August. Chief of the Ukrainian General Staff, Oleksandr Syrsky, announced in his statement that they have taken control of 1,294 square kilometers and 100 settlements in the Kursk region so far. Ukrainian General Syrsky, in his speech made at the Ukrainian Independence-themed forum held in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, evaluated these ongoing operations on the territory of Kursk. Syrsky stated that they were continuing to advance within the borders of Kursk, and that 594 Russian soldiers had been taken prisoner. If you remember, recently, the Russian Defense Ministry announced that 115 Russian soldiers taken prisoner on the territory of Kursk were released by Ukraine. In the same way, the Ukrainian government announced that 115 Ukrainian soldiers had been released and a prisoner swap had been arranged. Now, the Ukrainian leader has announced that they plan to achieve a great victory. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, although he did not want to give any details about the secret victory plan, stated that this plan consists of 4 stages. Zelensky stated that this plan began with the cross-border operation to Kursk. Kursk is part of our victory plan. It may sound ambitious for someone, but it is a very important plan for us, he said in a statement. It was stated that the second stage is related to Ukraine's strategic place in the world security infrastructure. The third stage is that a strong package will be presented that will force Russia to end the war diplomatically. It was stated that the fourth stage will be completely related to the economy. However, the claims of war analysts have been much more interesting. Expert war analysts have revealed some theories about this secret victory plan of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. After stating that the territory of Kursk was part of this victory plan, war analysts claimed that Ukraine would enter Kursk and many other Russian cities and annex these cities. As it is known, the Russian army has decided to annex these territories by occupying important regions such as Kherson, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Luhansk on the territory of Ukraine. The Russian military announced that it had annexed these territories by holding illegal referendums. In the same way, Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed that these Ukrainian cities and towns now belong to Russia and demanded that the whole world accept it. However, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had stated from the very beginning that all occupied Ukrainian territories, especially the Crimean Peninsula, would be taken back. Now, it has been stated that the Ukrainian army will capture some more Russian cities after the Kursk region of Russia and Belgorod. So what is the reason why the Ukrainian army wants to take over these Russian cities? Here's what war analysts say about it. At the moment, it is quite difficult to completely remove the Russian army from the territory of Ukraine. If the Ukrainian army conducts military operations simultaneously from many regions, the Russian army may possibly withdraw completely from Ukrainian territory. Since the Ukrainian government is also aware that this is a very difficult prospect, attacks have been launched against Russian cities with greater security weaknesses. As it is known, the Kremlin Palace had its eyes on the territory of Ukraine. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, made a reverse corner and began to take control of these cities by organizing ground operations against Russian cities and towns. According to the theory of war analysts, the Ukrainian army will use these Russian cities they have captured for barter. In other words, for every single town and city where the Russian army withdraws from Ukrainian territory, it will withdraw from Russian towns and cities in Ukraine. Ukrainian leader Zelensky, in his speech, expressed that they would put an end to this ongoing war with Russia in a diplomatic way. War analysts, on the other hand, claimed that this is the most appropriate theory for the implementation of this diplomacy. In other words, the Ukrainian administration plans to save Ukrainian cities and towns with the barter administration. In fact, some of these theories of war analysts have a fairly high degree of accuracy. Because the Ukrainian army has managed to capture the territory of Kursk, one of the strategically most important regions of Russia, while it has not been able to retake the Ukrainian towns that have been under occupation for 2 years. This is a big indication that Russia really does not care about military security in Russian cities. In other words, the operations of the Ukrainian army currently organized within the borders of Russia are ending much more successfully. As you can tell from the captured Russian soldiers and the 100 captured settlements since August 6th, the Ukrainian army is moving quite quickly within the borders of Kursk. One of the most important reasons for this is that the Ukrainian army blew up 3 bridges located within the borders of Kursk. The Ukrainian army, which managed to blow up 3 bridges used by the Russian army to organize military shipments, managed to deal a big blow to the Russian army in this way. With the unusability of this bridge, military shipments to Russian troops and army headquarters further along the bridge became impossible to arrange. According to 3 unnamed Politico sources who are said to know about Ukraine's actions, Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustem Umerov and the head of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's office, Andriy Yermak, will arrange a visit to Washington this week. What do you think the purpose of organizing this visit might be? Ukrainian officials want Washington to lift restrictions on the supply and use of American weapons. If these restrictions are lifted, there are indications that there are long-range targets that the Ukrainian armed forces could hit in Russia. The reason for Andriy Yermak's visit to Washington was said to be to present a list of these targets that Ukraine could hit to U.S. national security officials. According to the report cited in Politico, Ukraine is using this list to convince Washington to lift restrictions on the use of American weapons in Russia. Ukraine had previously presented the United States with a list of some potential targets in Russia. However, the current list is expected to be even more specific. 3 unnamed Politico sources, who are said to know about Ukraine's actions, stated that this list will be presented to the Washington administration soon. The U.S. administration has long suggested that lifting these restrictions would not make a strategic difference in the war. The reason for this is because Russia is said to have pushed its most important goals, including air power, over the border and out of reach. Politico quoted sources as saying that there are quite important targets that Kiev can reach with U.S. missiles. It is planned to change Biden's mind by giving the list to President Joe Biden. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on August 26 that Ukraine should not have any restrictions on the variety of weapons. Defenders of life should not face any restrictions on weapons. Umaram and Yermak's visit took place at a time when Ukraine is continuing its offensive in the Kursk region and trying to overcome the consequences of Moscow's massive airstrikes on the electricity grid on August 26. Ukrainian government officials want the military to be able to carry out attacks inside Russia more easily. Ukrainian officials, who stated that the United States should lift these restrictions on arms sales so that Russian troops can be pushed back from the border, want their demands to be approved as soon as possible. The Ukrainian government, which has been in negotiations with the U.S. government for a long time, has not yet been able to achieve this. The reason why the United States does not want to lift these restrictions is due to the fact that Russia has launched more aggressive attacks on Ukraine as a result of the lifting of these restrictions. In other words, Russian President Vladimir Putin will take an even more aggressive stance after these restrictions are lifted. He does not want to lift these restrictions because he is worried about this happening in the United States. U.S. President Joe Biden thinks there is little tactical advantage due to the fact that Russia has recently moved its military assets out of range. He also claims that Ukraine currently does not have enough Army tactical missile systems to hit high-value targets in Russia. The Kiev government uses a large part of these missiles in its operations in Crimea. Currently, it has been stated that the United States may send a limited number of ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. The Times newspaper shared some news after these events. The Times, which shared a news story under the heading "Ukraine will defeat Putin if it receives continuous assistance from its allies," managed to attract the attention of its readers with this news. He noted that the consequences of this war in Ukraine are spreading to Europe through espionage, cyber attacks, disinformation, and arson. He noted that no one should think that if Vladimir Putin successfully carries out this illegal invasion of Ukrainian territory, Putin will stop there. In other words, it was stated that Vladimir Putin will continue this occupation. It is well known that the Baltic states, which have a significant Russian population, also do not like NATO membership. Andrew Mitchell, the UK's Shadow Foreign Secretary, gave some important details in an article he wrote for The Times. Andrew Mitchell said, "Ukraine will win if we support it fast enough and for long enough. That's why we should use all our wonderful global diplomatic skills to lobby and convince everyone who cares about freedom that Ukraine's struggle is our struggle, that Russia's victory will not be fair. We need to provide all the weapons and allow them to be used in a way that will encourage Ukraine's courageous defense against the enemy and be consistent with international law and the rules-based system," he wrote. The Washington Post, on the other hand, published a news report that Ukraine has crossed the reddest of Putin's red lines. While the Ukrainian army was continuing its operations within the borders of Kursk, the size of this operation was mentioned. It was stated that Ukraine was the first foreigner to set foot on Russian soil since the Second World War. And we were given the detail that this incident is Vladimir Putin's biggest red line. The Washington Post stated that this operation, which took place in the Kursk region, was an ordinary ground operation. This was a direct ground attack carried out in Russia. However, despite these ground attacks, Vladimir Putin's reactions were extremely passive and silent. Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that any country that gets in Russia's way will face consequences that you have not seen in your entire history. It was obvious that Vladimir Putin's threat was clearly directed at countries that would arm Ukraine. However, the Washington Post newspaper noted that Moscow's red lines have been crossed many times. Especially important events such as sinking of Moscow, blowing up the Kerch Bridge in Crimea in 2022, launching an attack on the Kremlin and Moscow with unmanned combat aircraft in 2023, the flagship of the Russian fleet should be among Russia's red lines. The Washington Post quoted an academic with close ties to a senior Moscow diplomat who did not want to be named, as saying that Russia is very serious about the use of American and Western weapons within Russia's borders. However, Russia has not yet decided how to respond in the face of such a situation. Throughout the duration of the war, the Russian military has never hesitated to use its long-range missiles and unmanned combat aircraft against Ukraine. When the Russian army began to occupy the territory of Ukraine, it was carrying out this invasion with great self-confidence. Because the Russian soldiers were aware that the weapons and military equipment they had were much more powerful and dangerous compared to Ukraine. Russia has committed many war crimes, bombing hundreds of cities and Ukrainian army headquarters in Ukraine just by conducting airstrikes and forcing the withdrawal of the Ukrainian army from these regions. In particular, the Russian military's airstrikes on Ukrainian cities are one of the greatest proofs of Russia's crimes committed in this war. The International Criminal Court has definitively ruled that Vladimir Putin committed war crimes on the territory of Ukraine and issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. However, nothing could be done to Vladimir Putin due to the fact that Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute and does not recognize the decisions of the International Criminal Court. The long-range Iskander missiles and unmanned combat aircraft, which were in the Russian army inventory in the first months of the war, became Russia's largest advantage in this war. Of course, we should not forget about Russia's S-400 air defense systems. The Russian military has carried out numerous airstrikes against Ukrainian cities thanks to its long-range missiles and unmanned combat aircraft. Together with the ground attacks organized by the Russian army, it was also able to easily repel the Ukrainian army from these regions. Despite insufficient weapons and military equipment in the first months of the war, the Ukrainian army showed a great example of resistance against the occupying forces. This resistance of the Ukrainian army prevented the Russian army from occupying the capital, Kiev. Later in the war, weapons and military equipment sent by the United States and Western countries to Ukraine began to arrive. The Ukrainian army has become stronger against the occupying forces, thanks to the weapons and military equipment it has obtained from its allies. After a while, the weapons and military equipment in the Ukrainian army inventory became much more powerful than those used by Russia. Important weapons such as air defense systems, HIMARS missile systems, long-range ATACMS missiles, which Ukraine procured from the United States, have become important factors that have enabled the course of the war to turn in favor of Ukraine. At the same time, when Bayraktar started using TB2 model unmanned combat aircraft in Ukraine in response to the insidious warplanes used by Russia, Ukraine's air operations also began to increase. When we look at the latest situation of the war, it is seen that the Ukrainian army has now started to organize operations inside the borders of Russia. Previously, these operations were limited to airstrikes only. The Ukrainian army had begun targeting Russian army headquarters and energy infrastructures within the borders of Russia. Now it has launched ground operations against the Ukrainian cities of Kursk and Belgorod. Thus, the territory of Kursk suddenly became one of the regions where the war was most severe. While the Ukrainian army continues its operations intensively within the borders of Kursk, the Russian army is trying to strengthen its defense lines in the region. A critical move has come from Putin. Putin, who put other points into play after the failure at Kursk, was also faced with a very big truth. And with this effect, everything is completely confused with each other. Putin made one of the biggest mistakes of his career by using cruise missiles en route from the Black Sea to Odessa and the strategic importance of Crimea. In the last days of the Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian army began to make many moves in which it would completely prove its superiority over the Russian army. The most important of these was the successful operations that could now easily cross Russia's borders. The biggest example of this was recorded as the attack on Kursk. This move, in which all the advantages obtained against the Russian army were actively used, would have triggered a bigger crisis in all areas. Kursk was the biggest mistake the Russian military made after waging war on Ukraine. This region, which also causes Putin to face bigger problems, had not been sufficiently ignored by the Russian military before. Although it is located on the border, the fact that it hosts a small number of ammunition depots and headquarters made the decision-making mechanisms in this area pay more attention to Belgorod. Colonel General Lepin, on the other hand, took this to an advanced level and disbanded the council established by the Russian army and based on protecting Kursk. Instead, by sending a large number of inexperienced soldiers to the region, he ensured that Kursk was protected only on paper. But this mistake would have caused some very big losses in the Russian army. Putin was aware that the success rate of land-based attacks against the Ukrainian army was very low. In addition, although he intends to actively use the many advantages he has gained, the Kursk raid in Ukraine has caused the process to move to a completely different point. Despite these events, which are cited as the main reason for the increase in the difficulties experienced by the Russian military in a regional sense, Putin intended to mobilize some of the opportunities at his disposal for the invasion of Ukraine. The unexpected defeat of Kursk and the overflow of the war to the Russian borders revealed that many problems related to the process need to be solved immediately, and exactly what happened at this point was enough to change everything. The possibility of a possible attack on the Odessa region was being raised more and more every day. In addition, Putin, who has the possibility of applying the achievements to be achieved in a way aimed at directly gaining superiority over the Ukrainian army, made a very different move despite this situation in Kursk. First, a missile was launched towards the island of Zmyny in the south of the Odessa region. The intelligence report published about it stated that it was probably an anti-radar Kh-31P. In addition, cruise missiles sent back-to-back began to fly westward over the Sumy region and enter Ukrainian airspace. The fact that the missiles coming over the Black Sea have already come from near Snihurivka has prepared the ground for the formation of many question marks. And shortly after these events, Ukraine made a critical statement about the Black Sea in a report it published. This explanation was the kind that would cause a lot of information about the process to be revealed. Putin, who has a plan to attack Ukraine via the Black Sea, was also of a nature that would cause the tensions related to the process to become clearer. At this point, it was revealed by the intelligence reports of the Ukrainian army that there are 4 Kalibr missile ships with 28 missiles in the Black Sea. This would be recorded as the clearest proof that the Russian army was heading towards different points because it could not stop Kursk. The Ukrainian army, which is also likely to face bigger problems against the Russian army, announced that it has a large number of long-range missiles in Odessa and nearby ports in response to these moves in the Black Sea. The defense of HIMARS and Storm Shadows in this region has also shown that it will bring a great advantage in response to the possible withdrawal of the Russian army from Crimea. So the Russian army had no choice but to defend Kursk. But Putin, who still wants to intimidate Ukraine, has again turned his course to a different point despite this tension in Kursk. This was in such a way that it actually qualified as the basis of an important problem. According to the latest intelligence report published by the Ukrainian military, approximately 55 shaded unmanned aerial vehicles are flying over Ukraine. Similarly, 11 Tu-95 MS took off from airbases in Russia. And the MiG-31K was another important issue, which was also fixed by reports that a submarine and 2 frigates and Kalibr missiles and a small missile boat were also off the Black Sea. In addition, the fact that the 6 shaded unmanned aerial vehicle was also on its way from the Black Sea to Kherson was another important element that clearly showed how different things had come to a different point. If it continues in this way, it is expected that many advantages that will be gained against the Russian army will be reflected in the activities of the Ukrainian army in Kherson. During this process, the commissioning of a large number of air defense systems belonging to the Ukrainian army had caused many problems related to the process. However, it was quite possible to state that in this recent period, when the basic dynamics in Russia have become volatile, Putin's trust game from the public has also fallen drastically. If this continues in this way, it is not yet possible to fully determine how Putin, who will also have to face even bigger problems against the Russian military, will come to the fore again. This will show that the decision that Putin, who has gained advantages over the Russian army from a regional point of view, will make in terms of headquarters and munitions in Ukraine is largely related to the process. But at the same time, the possibility of all kinds of problems in Russia coming to the fore in different ways was such that it would clearly show that many basic dynamics in the region were also turning in favor of the Ukrainian army. After these events, it has not been determined exactly what kind of policy the Russian army will follow anymore. The fact that the effects of this problematic process against Ukraine are being felt very heavily actually indicates that many of the advantages gained regionally have been lost. As for this incident, the fact that Ukraine is not allowed to use long-range missiles within the borders of Russia is also described as the main trigger for some bigger problems. This has been recorded as another important factor that prevents the Ukrainian army from making a direct move from a regional point of view. But Ukrainian President Zelensky, who persistently asked to carry out this attack, became the focus of Kremlin spokesman Sergei Lavrov. And in the statements made, Lavrov clearly showed that a bigger crisis is imminent in all areas. The Russian army was also opening the door to bigger problems due to the difficulties it had experienced in its moves in the Ukrainian region. On the other hand, Russia, which is in such a vulnerable situation, could have been hit by the Ukrainian army with long-range missiles, which could have taken the process to a completely different point. The statements made by the Russian administration, which was also afraid of this, were largely parallel to these discourses. The fact that many advantages to be obtained against the Russian army were completely formed on top of this dragged things towards a completely different point. Lavrov's characterization of Kiev's demands to use Storm Shadow missiles to hit Russia as blackmail also caused a greater confusion. The fact that many planning projects in the region are based on this octagon has also increased the question marks about the process. Making the claims that it coincides with a different period have also started to strengthen. At this point, Lavrov's statements have moved to a much tougher place. This is an attempt by the West to appear as if it wants to avoid escalating tensions, but in reality it is a deception. The West does not want to avoid escalating tensions. The West, as they say, is looking for trouble. These statements are seen as the beginning of a process that can also be described as the most basic indicator of Russia's desperate situation. However, it is known that Ukraine, which is now taking clearer steps in all areas, has also caused it to face the problems experienced in the process. At this point, the comments made by war analysts have a quality that will show everything. According to war analysts, the Ukrainian army has advanced towards a completely advantageous position against the Russian army. As a result of this, it is also known that Ukraine has many positional advantages against direct attacks. It is claimed that if the advantages to be obtained against the Russian army are fully determined by the Ukrainian army, if it continues in this way, the process of change has started in all areas. And at this point, a much bigger crisis may arise.